We're live.
All right. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It is May 9th, Mother's Day. I hope you guys are celebrating Mother's Day right across the country. It's a beautiful day where we are. And this is REM Theory, and we're going to do a live Q&A on Apolloism. We did one a little over a week ago, and it ran, how long did it run, guys? It was probably close to
over 2 hours, I think. Or was it 2 hours? Maybe it was. I'd have to look. I don't know.
It was close to 2 hours, and there were still questions coming in. So we decided to do an additional one and get to some of the questions that may not have been answered, and also give you guys a chance to elicit some feedback. Let us know what sort of things you want to see in the REM Theory series as well. And so we'll go from there. Joining us and answering most of the questions tonight is going to be the esteemed Mark Brahman and our, what would you call yourself, Jack? Imperial, our Christianity expert, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I've had some experience. I mean, I've done some church. I did some church planning through Acts 29. I was a Christian throughout all my life. Dad was a Catholic, mom a Protestant. So I have kind of a eclectic or ecumenical kind of broad overview of all the different traditions. Hopefully I can add something.
Yeah, probably the best I've seen. So whenever you're ready, Mark, I mean, we can jump into the questions.
I'm ready to go whenever you got those questions. Let's
okay. So I've scoured the internet for the last couple hours, and I found some really good questions, and they're pretty in depth. So we're gonna hit you with them right away. Okay, question number one: is an Apollonian theocracy desirable or possible under the right circumstances?
Yes, it is desirable. So the idea with Apolloism, I mean, right now, of course, we're not connected to the state. We're sort of, in a lot of ways, we're effectively a powerless religion. The only thing that we have right now is what we consider to be the truth, right? So as far as establishing a Apollonian theocracy, we're a little ways off from that now. But the idea of Apolloism, it's very much a kind of Greco-Roman idea in the sense that our project is a religio-political project, in the sense that the state would be responsible for the religious function as well. And we see this as a kind of cohesive way of maintaining civilization effectively, and also of guarding our gens or familia, guarding our race. So that is the goal. The goal is to get to a position where effectively we become this official state religion, and there is no division between state and church, as it were, or state and temple in our case, right? So yeah, I mean, that's the short answer to that. I don't know if there's do you guys, Jack, did you want to jump in on that, or did you have any thoughts?
That was good.
Well, I do have one thought. I mean, it'd be interesting to think of what an Apollonian theocracy would look like, because I mean, we see with Julian, he was trying to institutionalize the pantheon. Isn't that correct, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I mean, Julian was a kind of an imperfect figure, and I think that in Augustus was also a kind of figure that we can look to as someone that was trying to restore paganism. He's a much earlier effort, of course, but part of the problem, it seems, it would appear, and this was true in Augustus's age, is that basically it seems that they had lost a kind of a true sense of their religion and what their religion meant. So much in the way that we're sort of engaged in the project of revival and reconstruction, Augustus found himself in the same position. Now, I think that he showed a lot of good instincts that I think that we would agree with. And the same, of course, is true with Julian. I mean, first of all, he was against Christianity, and he was going for effectively a pagan revival, but maybe a kind of imperfect one. And in the case of Augustus, though, we see some very kind of positive ideas that he was pursuing or developing. One of them was the reinstitution of the censors, right? Now, the censors were, I mean, they're very much like We think of like the Christian censors, that there used to be a kind of Christian censor board that would govern, or that had some influence or role vis-a-vis Hollywood, a Catholic censor board. So it was very similar to that. In other words, the Romans had censors, and you couldn't build a building or a temple in Rome without the approval of the censors. And the idea of the censors was they were there for moral reasons. They were trying to kind of maintain a Roman morality or Roman ethos. And they were, another example. So that was one of Augustus's idea, was to restore the censors, who basically, when Caesar, Julius Caesar rose to power, that institution was eliminated. The other thing he tried to do, Augustus, was to restore the cult of Apollo. Right, so this is one of many indications that he understood it as a kind of virtue cult, in the way that we also understand Apolloism.
Just to cap that off, actually, how would you see something like that manifesting, like an Apollonian theocracy in this day and age? What would that look like, in your opinion? Like, I mean, the institutions obviously are a lot different now. The way people interact with the state is different.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said, I think that we're far from there. I mean, I think that probably in a lot of ways, and I think that this is the way that we should view Apolloism, is that, in some ways it's an ideology in the way that Marxism is an ideology, in the sense that, we're creating the sort of ideal state. In the way that Marx was also looking to create the ideal state. But that doesn't mean that the power lies within us to create it ourselves. Now, I think in our lives that we'll make useful efforts in that direction that are in real life, useful efforts in that direction, so we can start to actually manifest the cult in real terms in the real world. But I think that one of the most important parts of the project, of course, is the dissemination of the idea of Apolloism, so that it becomes an ideal for others. So let's say, who knows, we're persecuted or we fail for whatever reason. Maybe we weren't good enough for the task, or we just, through whatever opportunities, we didn't have the power, to make it manifest in the world in sort of a kind of significant way. We're going to have children, and we can pass ideas on to our children, but the ideas will exist independent of us. Apolloism will exist independent of us, so other people can take up these ideas as well. I think that that's one way to think about it right now, in what we would call a dawning phase of Apolloism, where, often right now in this very early stage, I think it's excellent that we already have, very intelligent, accomplished, and successful people who are openly identifying as Apollonians, as the two gentlemen in this stream. That's a great sort of a point in the right direction. I think that that's a good sign. But many people will not be able to openly identify as Apollonians, but they still can contribute to this project, whether that ends up being financially ultimately, or they can identify as Apollonians and start operating through what we call crypto Apolloism, and start networking in the ways, for example, that Jews network, right? Those are
really any religious group, really.
Yeah,
they're all networking, right? Sorry.
Yeah, or Mormons, for example, would be another good example. Mormons, I would point to Jews and Mormons because I think that they're particularly successful in this regard. And the Mormons, though they have a theology that is, ultimately Christianity, though it's a very unusual form of Christianity, and it is kind of worth an analysis that I have yet to conduct. But Mormonism does seem, at least in practice, it does seem very connected to the cosmos, or to the here and now, in the sense that, there are, sort of these robust networks of Mormons who are successful in business, who are looking out for each other, and who are, in their conduct, in their behavior, they're not degenerates. You kind of, in some ways they are in their ideology, in the sense that ultimately it appears and again, I haven't conducted a sort of full analysis of that religion, so I can't judge it in a kind of very definitive way, but it is a form of Christianity, so it is ultimately deracinated, to the extent that it could be considered Christianity. And
with Mormons too. I mean, it's when you consider their numbers and the wealth that they've accumulated, they have a shocking lack of political power. I would say they really haven't transformed their demographic power and their economic power into political power, really, outside of Utah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think that's a good point. And I think that one of the real advantages that Apolloism has is REM theory, right? Because REM theory allows us to create art and ultimately create religion through an understanding of symbol language. And I think that is one of the huge liabilities of Christianity in general, is that they are kind of in a way prevented from a coherent understanding of symbol language through, to some extent, Christianity has this kind of lobotomizing effect where you can't sort of analyze, for example, an ET film and apply, what we call Roman interpretation, or a kind of updated version of Roman interpretation, to a Steven Spielberg film without understanding that Jews understand Christianity as something that is kind of a liability. In other words, it is something that ultimately serves their interests and doesn't serve our interests. So those are huge blind spots. And that is, that doesn't allow them ultimately to have artists that can make art that is on the kind of final and definitive level, symbolically coherent and moralizing in the sort of deepest kind of subconscious level, I would argue. One example would be guys like C.S. Lewis or Tolkien. I mean, C.S. Lewis comes up with this great term where he describes artists who are effectively, sort of Christian artists who are, in the case of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, they're making Christian art, at least as far as we know. I mean, no one has yet to conduct I think that Jack actually was considering doing this, like a kind of full REM analysis of Lord of the Rings. But as far as we know, that is Christian art. But he's using paganism in a pretty sophisticated and intelligent way as a kind of, it would appear as a kind of allegory describing Christianity. And it does seem that he is kind of recognizing correctly some symbols in Norse myth and sort of identifying their meaning as they relate to, Jewish and Christian symbolism. Right. But it's limited. It's ultimately limited. Because it's ultimately Christian. And C.S. Lewis has this great term called, he refers to artists as sub-creators. And that, because ultimately the Christian artist is a sub-creator in the sense that he can't kind of go beyond Christianity. And Christianity is a deracinated creed, unfortunately, and it is not something that's developed to serve our race. Rather, it's developed to hobble our race, it would appear, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue. And the next question, the questions are starting to come in now. We have one for Jack. Do you think Apolloism is at a disadvantage to Christianity because Christianity believes its beliefs to be literally true, i.e. Jesus and God being real beings, while Apollonians think Apollo is an archetype? That's from John Sherlock.
When I look at the world, I think religion is going to change. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of these heretical splits off of Christianity that obviously have parallels with George Floyd, this BLM movement where they've made him into a savior type. There's going to be a lot of disheartened white people, and they're going to be scouring culture, even their religion, which a lot of the people in the DR are right now. They're scouring it, trying to find every single angle to moralize their people. And what's going to happen is, I think religion fundamentally is just going to change. It's going to become this ultimate end of truth, where we've pushed truth so far where we don't care if something is real or not. We just need something for us. And I think that's where it's going to go. I mean, Another evidence you could point to is just the movie culture, where people watch these Marvel movies or Star Wars and literally imbibe them and take them in as like almost like a deity figure that they live their life by and are honored by. These kind of phenomenons we can laugh at, but that's religious. And I think just the religion of the future is going to be different for white people. They're going to be so desperate for their own people to be protected and ameliorated that they will seek something that isn't literally true, but mythologically it represents them.
Right. This is from the Three Blind Chickens. What do you think of Orthodox Christianity? I guess for both of you.
Do you want to take that one, Jack? And I'll follow up.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, they kind of stem from the apophatic tradition, where they emphasize the incomprehensibility of God, and it's more of a mysterious. They honor the mysteries more, so they would be more Eastern in that respect, where the Eastern ideologies, religions would kind of think about things in simpler terms, more mysterious terms, where the cataphatic Western view of theology with Catholics will label everything, and they'll go, they'll have all these doctrines. But what I think about the Orthodox tradition is that that basically that it shrouds itself in a lot of mystery. Theosis is their big doctrine, where you can kind of see it as being based where they say, God became man, so man can become God. So it's kind of you might feel moralized in that, where there's this divine nature that you bring into yourself and you become more godlike. There's a lot of
I think
decent thinkers.
Going on right now, I think a lot of people are just making the based association with Orthodox Christianity. They see countries like Russia, Putin, some other Eastern European countries, and so they're making that association that the religion of those countries, it must be different because right now they're experiencing a different manifestation of what that religion looks like in their country. So they're attributing those associations when they're probably more due to external political events and historical events leading up to this point. But as far as the religion itself is concerned, there really aren't any barriers that would, say, prevent it from becoming the #1 religion in Africa, right?
Yeah,
I think that's exactly true, and that's so. I think in the DR, it became attractive because it was because of the sort of the character that it took on, because of the sort of ethnicities that practice Orthodoxy, which are the Russians and the Greeks, who are kind of based in a sort of different way. I mean, I think that the Greeks are sort of like all Mediterraneans, are sort of universally sort of anti-Semitic on some level or whatever. They're just they're a tribal people. The Mediterraneans are kind of more instinctively tribal and more protective on a kind of instinctive level. And the Russians are, the Russians in a way are almost, they're a kind of a more Nordic type, but they are in a way, and this is not an insult to them because the Russians are very kind of based, but they are a kind of more barbaric in a way than the West. I mean, it's a kind of more a barbaric country in good ways and also in bad ways. And I think that that's the way that I would describe it. So the masculinity of the Russian man is something that people end up associating with Orthodoxy. But the creed itself is completely unrelated to this sort of virility of Russians.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I mean, a country like Russia is going to have a lot of geographic differences and historical differences. I mean, when you're in the terrain that is probably literally the most difficult terrain on Earth to protect, then you're just going to establish a different mindset altogether, right? And that would kind of fuse into the religion, even before that.
Yeah, you're going to be kind of badass, I think, is what you're saying. Right?
Yeah, you're going to say, look, man, we can have. I mean, there were Russians before they were Christians, right? So I mean, and they were invaded before they were Christians. So they're just going to develop with that hardened mentality that, you know what, we have to have some sort of in-group cohesive strategy, and, you know, Christianity may be kind of cucked or whatever, but we're going to, where it's possible, we'll adapt it to our needs, right? Next question. This is from Eric Mallet. Do you foresee any unique issues implementing Apolloism in Europe versus the United States, given the differences in culture and politics between the two entities?
It's a great question. Do you guys want to take it, and then I can jump in?
I'll go quick. I think my answer will probably be the briefest. I don't see any. No, I don't see any issues. I mean, I think probably structurally it would take a slightly different form. But I mean, in Europe, I mean, there's advantages in both continents. In Europe, you obviously have the tradition. You have Apollonian temples that are still there to this day. You have a population that's by and large rejected Christianity. You have stronger identities. So there are some advantages in Europe. In the United States, you have a population that is more open to religious practice, religious experience, and as religion as a form of community. You know, in England, community is made up of going to the pub or working man's clubs to a larger degree. And in the United States, I think it's drawn a lot together. Religion draws people a lot together in a communal spirit a lot more. So I think there's opportunities in both places. I think it'll take a little bit of a different form, but ultimately, I think Apolloism is something that really can bind and connect Europe and North America. I'll let you go. You go, Jack.
No, that's good. You got it, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are. I mean, you know, one thing is that Christianity is less of a, not even necessarily less of a cultural force, but less of a spiritual force, I would say, in Europe. And I see that as advantageous. So we have cases like, and I don't know how characteristic or guys like Imperial are, where he came, sort of directly from Christianity, in what I would say is a very kind of like moving and sort of earnest search for the truth, where he was just like, whatever the truth is, I'm interested in the truth, despite being a devout Christian. But I don't know how characteristic his experience is going to be. I think that certainly there will be people like that. And I think that one of the advantages Imperial has is that, and he can probably correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know exactly the way that he feels about Apolloism or thinks about it, but that maybe there's a sense, and maybe it's not the case with Imperial, but there will be a case with some Christians is that they feel like that they've been deceived, essentially, and that they have been sold a false bill of goods. And so there is a little bit of kind of anger or passion, associated with people who convert from Christianity into Apolloism. Now, I think that we have to be very level-headed, and there is kind of a treacherous path ahead of us in some ways, and that we have to be very kind of sober-minded in our approach. But I think that to the extent that it transmits passion to someone, that's a good thing, right? To the extent someone's irritated that they've been deceived, so long as that can be in the way that a sort of samurai warrior sublimates anger and turns it into productive, it turns it into works, for example, right? That's a good thing, right? I mean, we don't want to just be angry. We want to take our anger and sublimate it into valuable things, and not necessarily ever appear angry. So I think, I don't know how unique or how common Imperial's experience will be. I think that people who have effectively become atheists, which is more common in Europe, but are still racially minded and concerned about Western civilization, I think that they might be sort of easier converts in a lot of cases, but they may lack some of the kind of advantages in some cases that guys like Imperial bring, but may bring other advantages, and probably will. I mean, I think that our race is full of advantages once it's kind of directed to the right goals. I guess that's my long answer.
Well, you can see the desire to belong and to be a part of something just in the way they have the football supporters over there. So, I mean, that instinct is definitely there. And with respect to Europe, again, I mean, you have to ask yourself how many people are checked out of religion simply because the messaging of Christianity has been so completely at odds with, you know, what they feel and what they desire, right? You know, things like turn the other cheek, do not resist your enemies. Like, I mean, if you grow up listening to that, you're very likely to just take the position that religion is not for me, right? I'm not that kind of person. But when they see that it can actually be something that's eugenic, something that's aesthetic, something that motivates you to become stronger, to develop a will to power, right? And to strengthen your community, you know, it's a completely different mindset, really. And that's something that could reach a lot of people that may, like I say, have been checked out of it, right?
Yeah, we should probably ask Jack, because I feel like I was talking for Jack there. But I mean, Jack, do you feel like I was even close in my sort of characterization of your experience?
Oh yeah, yeah, you're right on the money. No, I remember just looking at all the different pantheons, and especially the Canaanite pantheon that showed that this stupid little idol of El with this gay little cap, not whatever, sorry, with this
Gay
little
in
cap.
terms of happy, yeah, happy.
Yes,
yeah.
it was very happy. And me and my wife kind of just looking at that and looking at what you're teaching us, and kind of, you know, we started kind of crying, because it's just like, is this thing really, have we really been deceived by a people group for so long to worship this El figure that obviously came from this stupid little idol and has now been birthed into what it is now, which is mostly Christian Zionism and esoteric worship of Israel and Jews and the other. And you look around the world, yeah, you get very passionate. Another one that really got us was the Samson. Yeah, when we brought up Samson, how he means man of the sun, and how like he was a Philistine. And I just watched something on Twitter where Richard Spencer had posted that he found an article that the Philistines were Indo-Europeans, and you start going through the Old Testament and wondering, hey, are we the enemies of the Jews in this story that we're reading to our kids? Are we teaching them to hate ourselves? And that's apparently what happened. And this man of the sun, Samson, sacrifices himself to kill his people in favor of the Jews. And he, you know, gets blinded, gets his hair cut off, all, you know, kind of telltale signs of REM theory. And yeah, it's frustrating. But the solution is because the solution is this: Apolloism. We follow Apollo, and he is the god of sober-mindedness. So the more you get frustrated, the more you have to press into Apollo, who is this sober-minded god that can kind of ground you in truth and ground you in, hey, we aren't going to rage or get mad. We're going to overcome our enemy. We're not going to get mad. We're going to get even, is what my dad would tell me when I was growing up.
Great advice. My dad used to say the same thing.
All right, we got two questions we'll knock off quickly. This is from John Sherlock. With Apollo being the northern invader, could that put off Southern Europeans? Probably not, because I mean, Apollo was worshipped in Southern Europe. And Mark, how many volumes of your book will there be?
There will be between 4 to 3. And the reason originally it was going to be 4, but book 1, we decided that because what happened, it got a little, hold on. It was getting a little ridiculous, because the problem is that, you know, once you follow these threads, you basically uncover so much, right? And the problem is that to make points that I was making in the first book, I had to sort of reference, you know, basically I had to make all these digressions. And the way that I dealt with the digressions was I would write an article dealing with a topic, and then I would footnote that article in book 1. But that article would appear in a book that was not yet to be published. So it became like this sort of problem where we finally decided, well, we can't be footnoting books that haven't been written yet. So I basically have to kind of in a kind of thorough but also as concise a manner as possible, basically put everything into book one, whether in footnotes or otherwise. So book one's going to be kind of a monster of a book, but it's also going to be sort of the lodestone, or it's going to be the what's the term? It's going to be, once book one is out there, it serves as a reference for all the remaining books, and it makes writing the remaining books very easy. But what ended up happening is probably that I've ended up sort of, I ended up sort of writing some articles or writing some chapters in book one that were sort of planned for later books. So I think it could be closer to 3 books as opposed to 4 books, or who knows, maybe 2 massive books or something. But the goal is to kind of make the arguments in as kind of compelling a manner as possible, but also make the arguments concise. So these books are not endless books, effectively. But these books will become very important references for any books that we write hereafter, right? So these books will become. We can now write books on cinema. We can now do REM analysis on cinema, REM analysis on comic books, or whatever, and we have these books as a reference that will make all this sort of kind of arcane points that you can't sort of readily make in the context of an article decoding Spider-Man or something, right?
Right. Okay. This is just a comment, Tonda. The fact that most temple in ancient Rome were Apollonian temples is something that made me curious, since Apollo is always underplayed in mainstream research. From SS, I would like to see a more substantive critique of Jason Reza Georgiani's Prometheism. Well, that would probably be an entire stream unto itself, I would think. One more comment. George Floyd is not a savior in the woke ideology. He's a martyr and a symbol of injustice, but calling him a savior deity is pushing it. Not yet. It's only been a year, right? Let's give it some time. I mean, there's murals to him, and I've seen people performing baptisms in the name of George Floyd. So yeah, he's not a savior yet, but give it some time, right? It's definitely going in that direction. Okay, now, this seems like it might be a long answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyways. Is there an Apollonian morality, and if so, is it universal?
Yeah, I mean, and this is my view and my recommendation as a kind of early founder of this revival cult, is that I think that the Romans, especially, and this is something actually Imperial pointed out recently on Twitter. He was posting about it, but the Romans, I really think, were successful in refining and sort of purifying the Greek religion, in making it kind of a more virtuous religion, as it were, and through a sort of refinement of this religion, becoming a more virtuous people. So I think that the Romans serve as a model to us in a lot of ways, in ways that the Greeks don't. Now, of course, Apollo has his origins in Greece, and Apollo is less salient among the Romans. So, the cult of Apolloism itself is distinct in some ways in the way that the Romans practice their religion. Now, ultimately, Apollo would kind of reemerge in the Roman pantheon, especially with Augustus. And Apollo was a god among the Romans, of course. But the more salient gods among the Romans were Jupiter, Mars, and there's another god too. I'm forgetting the pronunciation of his name. He's obscure now, but there was a third god that was also somewhat salient in Rome, that you could argue may have been related to Apollo. So ostensibly, it could have been another name for Apollo. You could argue it's less connected to a solar idea, but it's. I think the name is related to assembly, and it might. The name of Apollo is also potentially related to assembly or enclosure, and that becomes a kind of important concept in my mind, at least. And I argue that that should be a sort of that. I think that is a kind of good or useful etymology of the name Apollo. But in any case, I know the name of the god. I'm afraid to pronounce it because I think I will mangle the pronunciation, so I'm not going to pronounce it. But but what I would say is the following: is that our cult, this is a kind of revival religion, of course, and our goal is to refine these ancient gods, and part of that process is to rehabilitation, in the sense that we would recognize some myths as degenerate, as did the Romans, and we would we would designate some myths as canonical. And not only would we designate some myths as canonical, we would liberate ourselves to create additional myths and other parables through REM theory to create healthy and instructive parables and myths that are venerative, basically, of our race, and show our race succeeding, but are also teaching valuable lessons and pointing out dangers to our race, for example. So it is a revival religion, and it is not a cargo cult, and it is creative in that regard. That we are, we're, to a large extent, we're trusting our. Not only we're gaining inspiration from these ancient cults, and what we see as valuable is we're copying, but we're also creating, and we're also eliminating things that we see as degenerate, and we're using our good instincts as healthy Aryan men, and recognizing things that are kind of obviously degenerate and we think should be dissuaded. One example would be homosexuality, for example. Now, again, I argue that we shouldn't be fixated with homosexuality, or we shouldn't be persecuting homosexuals or anything like that. But I think that obviously that is something degenerate, and maybe that would be an example of, and I talked about this in the last podcast, maybe a myth should be developed, a parable should be developed showing Apollo rejecting a homosexual lover, for example. That would be a useful myth for us, right? So
this almost opens up it opens up another question. I mean, we know the Romans, and you could argue whether this was to their benefit or to their detriment, but they were very tolerant of other religions, even going so far as to incorporate certain gods. Do you think Apolloism is compatible with other religions?
Well, so, I mean, Apolloism, it is in a sense, well, hold on one second. So Apolloism, I argue that Apolloism represents the noble cult. And this is something I talk about in the video. So people should watch REM 3. That basically Apollo represents the noble archetype, right? He represents the nobility. So he represents the noble classes. Now, gods like Mars, and you especially see, or Ares in the Greek world, represents the martial, or the more common type, I would argue, in Aryan certainly, but he's also a kind of agrarian type, right? So he's also a farmer. So in other words, right there we see two cults, and I think that Apolloism would allow for a martial cult, or would allow for other cults, provided that they're servile to the Apollonian cult. So the Apollonian cult would exist in a hierarchy of cults, and it would be at the top of that hierarchy, essentially, though it would share honors with Jupiter, for example. I think that there's something that, in our race, we venerate our ancestors, we venerate our elders. Jupiter is the father of Apollo, and he's also the ancestor that overthrew Saturn. So there's a special place of kind of reverence for Jupiter, and so he is the king, and Apollo is the prince. But Apollo also represents something different. I mean, Apollo represents both, and this is something I discussed in the video, he represents both the ancestor, but he also is a kind of future-looking god, or he represents the sun, right? So he represents the son of Jupiter, and he represents the future, much in the way the Son of Man in both the Old Testament and in with Christianity, with the example of Jesus Christ, of course, he represents the future, right? He represents the Omega, the Alpha and the Omega. In the case is what Christ describes himself in Christianity. So that's what I would argue that Apollo also represents. And I mean, obviously, this is Imperial can tell me that this is a very heretical thing to say, but Apollo, I would argue, is the real Alpha and Omega. in the sense that the Aryan is is the founder, right? He is the firstborn, and that's understood in Judaism. Where the Aryan archetype is the firstborn in Judaism. So Apollo represents both the firstborn, but he also represents the Omega in the sense that our race is immortal. Apollo is immortal, so we will exist to the end, and we will outlast the other races to the extent that and this is not to the extent that any race dies off, it won't be us. We're the Alpha and Omega, right? And Apollo, the immortal god, represents the Aryan, and especially the noble Aryan archetype, and he is immortal, right? So we understand that myth is meaning that our race also is immortal, especially that noble element. But also the martial element is immortal as well, as a kind of guardian and protector of Apollo, I'd argue, as a warrior class, right? And he is also immortal. Mars is an immortal god.
Mars more dutiful, and I mean Apollo more, forward-looking in a destination, and a moralizing destination, I'd say. Question from Tonda: is it theoretically compatible with Apolloism to use some extent of gene modification to improve humans in the future?
Yeah, man, these are very very good questions, and I have a kind of instinctive revulsion, and this is just me, and I'm not the only voice in Apolloism, but I think that Apolloism is a eugenic cult, but I think that the eugenics is achieved through the pairing of the best people effectively. And I think that part of this sort of love connection that humans have, and the sort of, sex, for example, right? Rather, as opposed to like growing human beings in test tubes at some point and eliminating the process of sex altogether or love altogether. That is something that is repulsive and foreign to me. And I think that my idea with Apolloism is that though it is a eugenics cult, really it would retain this kind of human aspect in the sense that it would be a bride gathering cult and a eugenic selective bride gathering cult, where we would be looking to sort of further the best genes through encouraging the best pairings of people. Now, I don't think that this should become something that is a very clinical or cold calculation, but I think because I think that the thing that prevents it from becoming a kind of clinical and cold calculation is that the desirable eugenic attributes are often very much the things that people fall in love with, right? We fall in love with beautiful women. Beautiful women fall in love with beautiful men. Being strong or intelligent, these are all good things that people are interested in dating or whatever the case may be. So I don't think that it will become, and I don't think it should become. It should retain that sort of I don't want to use the word magic, but that kind of art and that culture, in the sense that love is a kind of a thing that I believe in ultimately. And I don't think that we should become a loveless people, and I don't think we have any reason to become a loveless people, because we are a very desirable people, right? Every other people effectively desire us, right? From a kind of,
and sometimes you have to question whether something artificial is in fact eugenic, right?
Yes.
There's an artificiality to things like that.
Yeah, and I am definitely opposed to transhumanism or becoming a different species. So I'm definitely opposed to that. And now, is it the case that through a kind of eugenic selection over generations that we become something that is on some level kind of unrecognizable to the people that exist now? In other words, we become a kind of Superman, a superior to the sort of the white man that exists now. Well, I think that certainly is a possible scenario, but what I would argue is that European man now is in a lot of ways inferior to his founders or his ancestors, right? And you can even look in the sort of American context. These were Christianized people, but they were becoming deists, and on some level, they were in the Enlightenment, and they were kind of moving toward atheism. But Americans, the founders, were a kind of more eugenic race in a lot of ways. I mean, they were kind of It's pretty obvious when you read their writing, for example, and they were obviously highly intelligent. So I think that there are these kind of shifts where a gene type improves or it degenerates, and certainly our effort should be toward amelioration and improving. And right now, certainly the greatest danger is through degeneration, right? So, for us getting at this moment, for us getting worried that we're going to become some like unrelatable, Superman in the future that is effectively a different species, not in type, but in degree, right? So, that's a word that Darwin uses, right? So it could become a superior type in degree, but it is still the same species. I think that ultimately we want to become superior and less degenerate, and that we have degenerated as a race. And our anxiety at this moment should not be that we become too great, right? Our anxiety at this moment right now is that we not degenerate or that we disappear as a race, right? Yeah. So I think that it is now, look, maybe in the future that needs to be curbed in some manner or not. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't need to be curbed, right? Maybe we do become like gods at some point relative to what we are now. And is that a bad thing? We will have to at some point escape from this planet and be able to start colonizing. I think we're not. This planet is our home, and it's where we originate, and we should always keep it and protect it for as long as it lasts. But if we want to be eternal, really immortal, we have to find a way to colonize the universe.
Yeah. A few comments. Outer Haven says, a Berber from North Africa told me he likes the concept of Apollo. Great. We'll welcome his support, right?
We have honorary Apollonians. People who are like basically fans and supporters, and we'll fight for the Aryan man.
Yeah, that's awesome. Our boy Steve Lauder, Apollo will reunite Aryan stock from around the entire world. Griffith, do you think that Islam could have useful elements or lessons for the development of Apolloism?
That's an interesting question. In my analysis, I haven't paid a huge amount of attention to Islam. I think that Judaism has been instructive for our analysis. Christianity has been instructive, but they've been instructive in the sense that we're looking at basically adversarial cults. And this is something I talked about in the last stream, is that we're looking at the kind of perspective of the adversary, but we're often kind of learning about ourselves through that perspective. And we're learning about weaknesses that we have that our adversary understands and is able to exploit. So that's useful. And but also the kind of the design of Judaism, there are some things that are kind of translatable to Apolloism, not all things, of course, right? And the major thing that is different about Apolloism and Judaism is that we have a different goal and we have a different vision of the world. Part of the cult is part of the purpose of the cult is to kind of change the world and make the world of 100 years or 200 years from now a different world. That's one that is a more Aryan world, that is that is a kind of a much higher level of civilization. This is much more we become a much more productive and successful people. And we kind of, in some ways return to some things that we've lost, but also improve on some earlier models. So in that way, we're distinct from Judaism, whereas Judaism is oriented towards, frankly, it's oriented against us. And the direction of Judaism promotes a kind of non-white world. The sort of activity and direction of Judaism promotes a destruction of the Aryan gene. So our goals are different, but the similarities are that they identify as a people and they cohere as a people and they work together for their group interests as a people. And that's also the design of Apolloism. So we are similar to Judaism in that regard, right?
Yeah. And, I think...
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say real quick, I think there's probably lessons that can be learned from just about any group if they're doing something successfully. And with respect to Islam, they certainly have a strong proposition in how the religion manifests itself politically. so that, people's behavior, politically, they tend to be very united. Their behavior is very governed. So they have some very strong elements in that respect. And yeah, in short, I think there's something that can be learned from any successful operation. Sorry, go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, what I've learned from Islam, which was brought up by a former Muslim who was interested in our group for a while, was the idea of blasphemy laws is interesting. Of course, that's kind of what got me red-pilled, was I figured out that all 4 schools of Sunni Islam believe in killing apostates, and that's kind of shocked my liberal mind into this world that we are now, where I'm trying to figure out how the world actually works. But anyway, my thing I was going to say about Islam is that blasphemy laws are starting to make sense, in that once you take down a people's god, then the people fall with it. And I feel like that's, kind of what's happening through the death of God in the West, and it also is kind of what happened in Rome, where they put kind of Plato's metaphysical, unknown, incomprehensible God above the Olympians. And then the Christians kind of came in and started saying, that's our God, that's who we are. Acts 17, Paul talks about that. He talks about that unknown God that you have, from Plato. That's our God. And that's, they should have seen that as subversive to their, to Jupiter, to all the gods that represent racially, represent their people. If you put anything above your people's God, or take down your people's God, your people are gonna eventually fail.
Yeah, that's a good point on the blasphemy laws.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. And I mean, the Romans identified Christianity as subversive, considered it a form of atheism. And I might even have a more kind of generous view, in the sense that, I think the Jews, I think that their God is in a way as real as our God. Certainly, and we could identify their God as Saturn, for example, or Bacchus, or gods like this. So I think that by acknowledging that their God is real, I think that we also acknowledge it as a kind of real force in the world that we can't sort of disrespect, in the sense that we have to be wary of it and recognize its power, and recognize that it is powerful, and that Jews are a kind of very formidable adversary, essentially, and that they do deserve that respect, and that these gods deserve that respect, and do represent real forces in the world. So from that perspective, to the extent that we understand Yahweh and Saturn to be akin, the Romans respected Saturn, and the Romans put Saturn in chains, right? And or that's what they argued. They put Saturn in chains in Tartarus, and they describe a myth where Jupiter conquers, Saturn, the Aryan man, triumphs over this Jewish or proto-Jewish god, and they had temples. The treasury was a temple to Saturn, and thereby, kind of identifying the nature of the god. It's Saturn is a wealth god, like Pluto, you could argue. I certainly think that's the case. So he's a wealth god. They erect a treasury and designated Saturns. But what doesn't change is that there's no question as to who sort of rules the civilization. Aryans are on top. Jupiter is the god. He's the ancestral god. Apollo is his son. These represent the nobility. And Mars, another Aryan figure, is also protected by the gods. He has a god, the martial type is protected by Mars. There's a patron god to a kind of racial type in that society, Yeah.
All right, we have 6 minutes left, so let's blaze through these remaining questions. This is from Leon Apricus. In the Gilgamesh epic, does Enkidu represent an Indo-European type? Yes. Enkidu being a wild man, barbarian, and perhaps also hairy like Esau in the Bible. If so, is hairiness another Aryan signifier, presumably in literature?
I think it is. Jack, do you have any opinion on this before I go, or? Yeah, no, I think it. It is. I mean, one thing I'm careful to say that, like, the thing about myth and parable analysis is that sometimes there are clues that are indicating, there can be kind of these red herrings in myth where, and we talked about this a little bit on the last podcast, where someone was saying, well, if the Norse frost giants are Aryan figures, doesn't that mean all giants in myth are Aryan figures? And I pointed to example, well, in Norse myth itself, fire giants appear not to be Aryan figures, right? So our analysis can't be overly blunt, and sometimes you'll encounter things that are red herrings. So am I prepared to say on the stream that, like, every time you find a hairy character, it's an Aryan character? No, I'm not, because I mean, one, I haven't evaluated every parable or myth that exists in the world, so I'm not in any, I don't know, there's probably very few people that could make that. Very few people who would have that knowledge to even make that sort of assessment. But what I would say is that does, I mean, certainly in the it certainly does appear to be an indicator in Genesis with Esau, who is depicted as someone with red hair, or he's hairy, in contrast to Jacob. Now, I think that there is actually, and he's also an example of one of these Aryan firstborns, but it actually does appear to have some basis in sort of reality or in human genetics, in the sense that Scandinavians, I mean, if you look at Scandinavians, are actually kind of among the hairiest Europeans. Now, Italians are also hairy, but you could argue that they inherited that from earlier northern invaders, for example. But Scandinavians are hairy people, so I mean, maybe the reason it's not noticed as often as it is noticed with Italians is that they're a fairer people, right? So it's less kind of noticeable that they're also a hairy people, but they're hairy people, and I mean, you might argue, in one of my sort of like out there theses is that while I think in the civilizational context, it is the case where you most commonly find an Aryan founder who you can understand as a civilizational founder. There could also be, and maybe this is not, I think a more careful case has to be made, but this sort of Aryan founder type might be kind of closer to a sort of caveman type, in the sense that he's a hairier type. So he might be emerging from a type that it has a furry pelt, for example, right? Yeah. So there might be something to that, right? Now, and that might only apply to kind of the northern context. So I'm not making any sort of bold or strong statement here in terms of who is the earlier development, the Asian or the Aryan or the Negro. I mean, I think it's still, it's generally guessed that Negroes are kind of an earlier type.
The Epic of Gilgamesh is actually a fascinating. It's a fascinating read, right? I mean, we could do a deep dive just on that alone.
Yes, yeah, but I think that, so there is some basis that hairiness is at least in the Genesis is a reference to Aryans.
Okay, I'm going to hit you with one last question before we go. Will you guys do another video on Apollonian virtues, both personal and social? Do a video on Apollonian virtues.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, definitely. Sure.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, that's referring to the Roman virtues that we've talked about those before. So yeah,
and we would discuss the Roman virtues, right? Because we see ourselves as a kind of, I mean, arguably we're an Americanized cult, or we're a Westernized cult, but we see ourselves as kind of a Romanized form of Apolloism. So I think it's useful to talk about the Latin virtues, because I think that those are kind of the most applicable to us.
Yeah. Well, we'll probably have to do another one of these in a week or two, I think. Do you guys have any closing thoughts that you'd like to add? Jack?
No, I'm good. It was fun.
A man of few words.
Yeah.
Mark, how about you?
No, I'm good as well. I think this was good. And as far as my last theory, just a theory, just so guys don't go crazy. And it's not, it's a kind of immature theory, but I think someone could pick it up. It's actually, I'm sort of riffing off Henry Fairfield Osborn, who posited, but never proved, and I don't think anyone has really proved anything definitively in terms of early ancestors, but Henry Fairfield Osborn posited that, something closer to an Aryan type might have been closer to an original firstborn man. And his thesis was that he emerged from Central Asia, but was something closer to Aryan man. He never proved that, and people have since so discredited the guy in quotation marks. But his theory was that the Aryan man is a kind of more generalized type, which I think is a fascinating theory. The Aryan man is a kind of more generalized type, and that other types are more specialized. So, and I think you definitely can say this with Jews. I think Jews are a kind of highly specialized type that evolved in a kind of urbanized environment. I think that is something that appears pretty evident. Whereas, and blacks may have kind of specialized in other ways. Like you could imagine theoretically, Aryans, sort of racially degenerating, becoming darker in a tropical climate or something like that. That's one theory. Or, there are other theories, that an African type is an earlier type. But that's a kind of more commonly accepted theory. I think it's, Dutton points to that in his book. So, but I think it's something that someone should take up as a project and investigate, is what I would argue. I don't have time to do it myself, but I think it's an interesting theory. And the thing that's kind of interesting about it too is that, can it be proven definitively false or true either way? I don't know. What I would say, in the civilizational context, it does appear evident that in many salient cases, civilization is founded by an Aryan and then degenerates and becomes non-white. And so the Aryan is the firstborn in the civilizational context. In the larger biological context, I think it's something that someone should pick up and study and look at and see if an argument can be made from another perspective.
Awesome. All right. On that note, we want you guys to go out, enjoy Mother's Day, hit like, hit subscribe, visit us at remtheory.net, make a donation so we can continue making videos, and we will see you guys soon.
Bye-bye. See you guys.